growing fallout over the killing of Iran's top military leader. Iraq's parliament votes to expel foreign troops. Now President Trump is threatening sanctions against Baghdad. So what will this mean for the U.S. presence in Iraq, and what consequences for the wider region? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly by Thibaut. The Middle East is grappling with the United States' assassination of Qassem Soleimani. In an extraordinary session on Sunday, Iraq's parliament voted to remove foreign troops from the country. Caretaker Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi says the government is preparing legal and procedural steps to implement that resolution. It's provoked an angry response from U.S. President Donald Trump. He's threatening what he calls very big sanctions on Iraq if American troops are forced to leave. NATO ambassadors, meanwhile, held an urgent meeting on Monday to discuss the escalating events. The alliance suspended its training mission in Iraq, fearing soldiers could be attacked in reprisal for Soleimani's killing. From Baghdad, Simona Fulton explains what happens next.
Each one of the countries that has troops here in Iraq, including the US, but also other countries like the UK and France, they have their own agreements with the Iraqi government that govern the presence of these troops, and those agreements stipulate exactly how these agreements have to be terminated. What happened was that Parliament passed a decision, not a law, calling on the government to draft legislation to expel foreign troops. Now, what would have to happen next is that the government would actually have to draw up a bill. That bill would then have to be sent back to Parliament to be discussed and to be voted on. The thing that complicates this further is that the government is currently in a caretaker role after Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi resigned in November amid ongoing anti-government protests. So we would also first have to have a new Prime Minister nominated. That Prime Minister would then have to form a new government, and that government would have to draft this bill. Now, under the current agreement between the US and Iraq that also governs the presence of military troops here, there would need to be at least a year notice to cancel this agreement. So it doesn't seem likely that we will see the departure of foreign troops anytime soon. And let's also remember that while there was a sufficient majority in parliament to vote for this decision, the Sunnis and the Kurds did not participate in this session, and they are calling for time to discuss such strategic decisions. They don't believe that such decisions should be politicized and taken in haste. What was significant, however, was that Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi himself attended the session and he spoke out in favor of the expulsion of foreign troops, and that is something that we haven't really seen since 2014, when the government invited US troops to take part in the fight against ISIL. And so far we have seen prime ministers take a more balanced position to manage the relations with both US and Iran. But what we've essentially seen here is the current caretaker government clearly taking a side and asking for US troops to leave.
Now, here are some of the countries with troops in Iraq. The U.S. has at least 5,200 soldiers as part of the international coalition against ISIL. It announced the deployment of 3,500 extra troops to the region to boost security after Qassem Soleimani's killing. 400 British personnel are in Iraq. Canada has 850 soldiers supporting Iraqi security forces and leading the NATO training mission. Australia has about 350. And France has 1,000 in Iraq and Syria combined to help the fight against ISIL. Well, let's introduce our panel now. In Washington, D.C., Richard Weitz, a U.S. defense analyst in Geneva by Skype. Jean-Marc Rickli, head of global risk at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. And here in Doha, Zaidon Al-Kinani, a Middle East analyst and an independent researcher on identity politics in Iraq. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. Thank you for being on Inside Story. Richard, in Washington, D.C., let me start with you. The withdrawal of U.S. troops in Iraq was something Donald Trump has wanted since he took office over 3 years ago. It was a campaign promise. He promised to get U.S. troops out of the Middle East. So why is he now threatening Iraq with sanctions should it force U.S. troops to leave?
Well, even if he wants to remove U.S. troops now, he doesn't want to look like they're being thrown out. But more generally, President Trump has, as you said, campaigned on reducing U.S. foreign military interventions, getting allies to take more of the burden, financial and otherwise, and did not favor the original U.S. intervention in Iraq. But in office, he has, like many previous presidents, moderated his position. He's listened to pressure from the national security establishment, from the U.S. Congress, from U.S. allies and partners, and kept troops in Afghanistan, Iraq, and even Syria longer than he might have liked. And I think that's what we're seeing now, that he's being advised that a withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq abruptly would open the door to ISIS, would encourage sectarianism in Iraq, and so on. And so he's trying to get in top of a decision. If there's going to be a U.S. withdrawal decision, he would want to make it on what he thinks is the best timetable from the point of view of the Pentagon and the Iraqi defense situation.
So is he likely to go ahead with this threat to impose sanctions on Iraq if they were to go ahead with this withdrawal, or is that just rhetoric? Because, of course, the risk would be here to further push Iraq into Iran's sphere of influence.
Right. Well, so another feature of President Trump's foreign policy is that he often will use a strategy of escalate to de-escalate. So he's making a lot of bold rhetoric, moving U.S. forces into the region and so on. But the ultimate goal is to de-escalate the crisis and ideally eventually get the security situation when the U.S. forces can withdraw from Iraq. So that's how I see these threats. I don't think that he would implement them, or at least that he plans to do so at present unless something changes. But they do have the effect, he thinks, of persuading the Iranians, Iraqis, and others to be more responsive to his demands.
Before I bring in our other guests, Richard, I just want to pick up on what you just said there. If the ultimate goal of President Trump is to de-escalate the crisis, as you say, why then risk killing Qassem Soleimani?
Right. That decision-making process isn't totally clear yet. From media reports, he was given a range of options in response to the killing of the U.S. contractor and the siege in the U.S. embassy, and he chose this as the optimal response. The administration's representatives are saying there was a risk of an imminent threat to the U.S. forces. There were other, the target had a long record of being involved in anti-U.S. activities, held responsible for killing of a number of U.S. forces. So that may be why. We don't precisely know yet what the decision-making process was.
All right. Zaidan Al-Kinani, let me bring you into the conversation. The resolution to expel foreign troops from Iraq barely passed in the Iraqi parliament. The session, as you know, was boycotted by most of the Sunni and Kurdish members of parliament. So there are clearly divisions in Iraq, within Iraq, as to what the way forward should be. Is the government in a position, really, to say that it wants to end foreign military presence in Iraq today?
Of course not. It's not in a position to do so. That is the very same political class, or the ethnic sectarian quota class, that was installed by those U.S. troops. That is just a political show to satisfy the Iranian influence interests in the Iraqi government and in Iraqi domestic affairs. The Iraqi government realized that the Iraqi government must give something in return for the loss of General Soleimani to the Iranian government. In that way, they must stand up against the U.S., even if it's put in a symbolic way, while they would realize that the U.S. wouldn't withdraw.
So
the
U.S.
troops
troops
wouldn't withdraw from the U.S. and their ways.
You think this is just symbolic and that the government will not, this is a caretaker government, of course, so ultimately the decision will lie with the next government. Do you think that they will not go ahead with this?
No, they might go ahead with it, but they might realize that this won't happen without the blessings of Donald Trump. Donald Trump made it very clear that if he ever wants to withdraw the U.S. troops from Iraq, he will do it under his own conditions and not in a way where he would be kicked out of Iraq. And even if they did withdraw, even if the U.S. troops would withdraw from Iraq, there are still military bases in Iraq. So the question is, did that parliament vote against the withdrawal of all the U.S. troops, including the ones in the military bases, or only the temporary ones that came throughout the temporary partnership during the war against ISIS. If it's only the troops from the second option, then the troops in the first option would still allow the US to have a very prominent military strategic influence in Iraq, whether it's against the Iraqi people's destiny or against the Iranian influence in Iraq.
Right. Jean-Marc, Rickli, European forces on the ground are caught in the crossfire of this escalation between Tehran and Washington. Will they have any influence on any withdrawal process if it was to happen?
Well, the only influence that the Europeans have will be diplomatic. We have seen over the last few months that Europeans have very little leverage on politics in the Gulf. We've seen that when President Trump announced withdrawing its forces from Syria. Although the operation was maintained to fight ISIS, the operation led by the European had to be scaled down because the European relies on the backbone of US military power in the region. We also see the fact that the European were powerlessness when they tried to implement this barter system in order to go around US sanctions against Iran. This barter mechanism called INSEC was set up a year ago in January 2019 and has been not workable since then. So the Europeans are totally relying militarily on the American to exert any kind of leverage in the region.
All right. Richard, your thoughts in Washington. What consequence if foreign troops were to leave Iraq? The State Department says that the presence of the so-called global coalition is needed to defeat ISIL, but already they've suspended operations against ISIL following the death of Qassem Soleimani.
Right. So the U.S. troops are there primarily for two purposes. One is to combat terrorists, and particularly ISIL. There's a fear of resurgence in Iraq and along the Iraq-Syria border in particular. And they're to train the Iraqi security forces to perform this role and develop other skills. So if the U.S. forces are confined to base for force protection reasons or withdraw, then the Iraqi security forces wouldn't have the support, and ISIL would face less resistance. So what would probably happen is I think the Iranians would try and fill that gap, but if they do, that's just going to encourage the sectarian split in the Iraqi National Security Forces. It'll alarm the Kurds and the Sunnis. So I think it could be counterproductive. So this is why I think that the Iraqi decision makers have got to balance their need to, as our previous guest said, appease Iran versus the danger of what would happen if you do pull out all the Western forces from Iraq.
But if U.S. troops were to leave Iraq, that would leave their forces in the region, in Syria in particular, vulnerable as well, wouldn't it?
Not necessarily. So they leave Iraq, but they have bases as throughout the region, some much larger than Iraq. So they could pretty much perform any operation other than perhaps some Iraqi counterterrorism and training missions. So if they needed to engage in a war with Iran, for example, they could easily do so not using Iraqi bases. So that it would be the main cost would be for the counterterrorism in Iraq, and then secondarily in Syria, because the Iraq-Syrian border is so porous and ISIL would, flows across that still.
Zaidan Al-Kinani, is every Iraqi behind this decision to expel foreign troops from their country? Because the protests that we've seen in recent months in Baghdad and various other Iraqi cities have not just denounced the presence of foreign troops, of U.S. troops in Iraq, but also Iranian influence in Iraq. So if Iraqis today are cornered and are forced to choose between the U.S. and Iran, who's the safest choice for them?
The safest choice is to have both of them leave Iraq. The entire reason why this escalation or the tension escalated between the US and Iran is because both of them were trying to orchestrate something that would pull the attention away from the Iraqi uprisings that began in early October. The Iraqi youth-led movement that began in early October 2019 flipped the entire equation, the equation of the balance of power between several regional power players in Iraq, beyond the US and the Iranian rivalry in Iraq. But if we were to look at both of them, if we look at the consequence of the sequence of the events, starting from the base in Kirkuk, where the American contractor civilian got killed, it's very obvious that Iran tried to orchestrate something to pull the attention away from the protests that carried a very heavy anti-Iran sentiment, a very heavy sentiment against the Iranian dominance and influence in Iraq. And of course, that influence came along with the US invasion in 2003. So I'm just adding to the point that Richard mentioned. The reason why the US would like to stay in Iraq is not because they want to fight ISIS or because they would like to support the Iraqi armed forces, which they themselves destroyed when they invaded Iraq. If the Iraqi security really mattered, if the Iraqi national security really mattered to the US, they wouldn't have destroyed the armed forces. They wouldn't have destroyed the police force in Iraq and left a militarily vulnerable Iraq to Iran. The safest choice to the majority of the Iraqis is to have no external factors being present in Iraq.
But Zaidan, let me ask you that. If you say that's the safest choice, would Iraq be in a position to defend its sovereignty without that US presence, the presence of foreign troops, and Iran, in fact? Because as we saw what happened with ISIL, you know, Iraqi forces needed that external aid.
That external aid was in addition to the fight against ISIS. If we look at the numbers of soldiers and the numbers of sacrifices in the war against ISIS, most of them came from the Iraqi people themselves, despite of the components of the societies, whether they were Shias, Sunnis, or even Kurds. Most of the people who fought in the war against ISIS were the Iraqi people. Of course, they're going to receive the support of regional power players or the US or the international coalition. The US have to stand up against ISIS with Iraq, since it was the country that allowed a vulnerable Iraq to be attacked by a terrorist movement. Of course, Iran would support the Iraqi people or the Iraqi government in its war against ISIS because it fears that expansion, that ISIS expansion would have reached Iran, or it would have limited the powers of its very own pro-Iran militias on the ground and in the Iraqi political arena. The Iraqi people can definitely face any challenges and obstacles. It is the Iraqi people that double the equation, which allowed the US and Iran to become so aggressive and to the extent that they even killed one of their top generals, which is Qassem Soleimani.
Jean-Marc Rickli, do you agree with Zaidan? Is Iraq in a position to defend its sovereignty today if foreign troops were to leave?
Well, that would be very complicated, I think, because the Iraqi forces have been depleted after US invasion in 2003. Also, the Iraqi society is deeply divided, and therefore that would be very difficult to come up with a strong government. But beyond the domestic factors, if the American troops, the Western troops, were to leave Iraq without Iran leaving Iraq as well, then that would probably strengthen the sectarian divide in the Gulf and strengthen the position of Iran in the Middle East, and that would be perceived as a adding threat to the already very unstable situation in the Gulf, and therefore we could foresee probably an escalation of violence in the region.
Richard, your thoughts? Zaidan seems to think that the problems lies with the foreign presence in Iraq and that Iraqis would be able to basically assure their own security if these foreign troops were to leave. Do you agree with that?
That's possible. I mean, ISIL was severely weakened. There are some reports that it's reconstructing itself, but it's possible that the Iraqi security forces have been sufficiently trained that they could work with the Kurds or other forces to do this. But what the scenario would probably happen, though, is if the U.S. leaves, it's not, why would Iran leave? I mean, I think what would happen was the U.S. and what NATO forces would leave, but then the Iranian presence would grow, and that would strengthen ISIL. That would lead the Sunnis to join it. And so I think that's the scenario you're more likely to get, rather than if you withdraw. I mean, it would be, in principle, great if you could withdraw foreign forces and have Iraqi neutrality guaranteed and internal security guaranteed, but it's hard to see how you get there from where we are now.
The U.S. certainly, until now, is upping the threats against Iran, even though they say they want to de-escalate and don't want regime change here. And I think it's very difficult for a lot of people to understand what the ultimate U.S. strategy is here. Is there one to start with?
Well, the goals of the U.S. are stated. So it's counterterrorism, counter Iran, strengthen Iraqi sovereignty, work with allies and partners elsewhere in the Middle East, and so on, bounce to get a better Gulf security situation. How you get there is a hotly debated topic. So the strategy in paper hasn't changed that much, but some of the recent developments have made it very, they're certainly much more complicated now. I think the U.S. wants to retain a military presence for now in Iraq. It wants to counter Iranian attacks on U.S. forces that have occurred in the past and could occur in the future in Iraq or elsewhere. And then it's just a question of tactics. So I think, as I said, I think the President Trump strategy is just to make the fear of war so strong in the minds of the Iranian and decision makers and others that we will diffuse the crisis just to avoid a major conflagration.
Zeydan, do you think this is a strategy that could work in this region, in Iraq and other countries?
Of course it could. It wouldn't work in that way because the U.S. in itself is using Iraq as a playground against Iranian influence. Iraq is becoming a battlefield between Iran and the U.S. So at the end of the day, the U.S. never looked into the region, whether it be Iraq, Syria, or Lebanon or Yemen, as places where they would like to impose their soldiers to defend them from an evil or an unhealthy influence, such as the Iranian regional influence. The U.S. presence in Iraq today is to maintain its power in the region. It's to maintain its military muscles across the world. The U.S. military presence in Iraq is based on the very same reasons why it came in 2003.
Zeydan,
and the Iranian influence.
Yeah, let me ask you, what about other Arab countries, i.e. Saudi Arabia? Would they help Iraq to keep Iran at bay?
Of course they wouldn't. One of the main reasons why Iraq became so military vulnerable to Iran and politically and socially vulnerable is because Iraq never received an Arab support to support the Arab identity or if there is such an Arab-Persian rivalry between Iraq being the gate of the Arab world against Iran. Iraq had to face the Iranian hegemonic regional expansionism due to the destructive U.S. invasion by itself. Saudi Arabia was never there for Iraq if we were to look for an Arab country that ever supported Iraq against Iran. Turkey was never there for Iraq against Iran if we were to consider Turkey to be the regional power player, which is more interested in creating a unified Sunni front against Iran in an indirect way. So no one stood up for Iraq.
All right. I'll give you the last word, Jean-Marc, in Geneva. Do you think it's too late for diplomacy to avert a major escalation in this region following the assassination of Qassem Soleimani? There's been a lot of talk in the last few days of a major conflict possibly between Iran and the United States. Can diplomacy still work?
Well, it's never too late for diplomacy to kick in. I think that it will be difficult, as was mentioned in Washington. It's escalation to de-escalate. The problem of this strategy is that the retaliation now by the Iranian and the level of retaliation will define the U.S. response. So Europeans, as well as Russian and Chinese, will have a very hard time to convince both parties to back down if one is considered as having gone too far. And this is the case for now with the killing of Soleimani. We have to wait for the Iranian response. But if we think that it would target US troops or even American civilians in the region, it would be very, very difficult for outside allies to put pressure on President Trump to back down.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to further explore this crisis in the coming days here on Al Jazeera. Richard Weitz, Zaydan Al-Kinani, Jean-Marc, Rickli, thank you very much for being on Inside Story. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can, of course, also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibaut, and the whole team, thank you for watching. Bye for now.